In the summer of 1905, the premier passenger train of the Pennsylvania Railroad was the Pennsylvania Special. This all-Pullman service, later rechristened as the Broadway Limited, ran between Chicago and Jersey City, with a ferry connection to New York City. New York Herald reporter Hamilton Peltz was dispatched to ride in the cab of the westbound Limited to Chicago. This is his story of the trip. From New York to Chicago in 18 hours, with the man behind the throttle. Perhaps you have made that marvelous run on the Pennsylvania Special, pampered by all the luxuries of the electrically lighted library smoking, dining, sleeping, and compartment observation cars, with their bathrooms and barbers, their stenographers and stock bulletins, their staterooms, easy chairs, polite porters, and waiting maids, and everything else possible to coddle you and ease your journey. For a month now, all that has been a common experience, and the hustling, driving businessman of New York or Chicago already regards his 18-hour train as a matter of course, much as he does his morning paper or his after-dinner coffee. He has forgotten, if he ever knew it, that less than 30 years ago, 36 hours to Chicago was thought a wonderful run, and that when the Pennsylvania Limited cut the schedule down to 23 hours, it was thought that even 20th Century Enterprise could do no better. But as you ate a lobster a la Newburgh in the dining car, or idly watched the smoke wreathing from your Perfecto in the library smoking car, how many of you have ever stopped to think, how fares it with a man up front, in the leaping, quivering cab of the locomotive, the man whose eyes must be ever riveted ahead, whose steady grip clutches the throttle, the man who holds your very life in the hollow of his hand? Oh, it is a very different story up there, amid the oil and soot, in the reeking swelter of the boiler and the scorching breath of the firebox. And that is the story which a reporter for the Herald was detailed to tell. His special equipment consisted of an unlimited stock of faith in the man behind the throttle, a cheap suit of blue and white pinstripe overalls, a pair of automobile goggles, a small package of rations, and a permit signed by W. W. Atterbury, general manager, instructing conductors and engine drivers to extend to the novice the hospitalities of the locomotive cab. It was a Saturday afternoon in midsummer. The great train shed of the Pennsylvania in Jersey City was as busy as an anthill. The exodus of the holiday seekers was on in earnest. They were storming the gates to take to the seashore expresses for Long Branch and Atlantic City. Terminal facilities were taxed to the utmost, but no rush of holidaymakers, no combination of circumstances is permitted to interfere with the prompt departure of the Pennsylvania Special. Number 29, as she is known in the official parlance of the road, is the pet of the system, and to her all else must yield precedence. She is scheduled to pull out of the Jersey City train shed at 14 minutes past 4 every afternoon, and you might safely set your chronometer from the moment Traphagen opens the throttle of his big pet, and locomotive number 1416, with an admonitory snort, glides smoothly out into the sunshine from under the smoke-begrimed arch. C.H. Traphagen, a veteran of the road, though one yet in the prime of his manhood, sat in the engine driver's box. Firing for him was W.S. Denniston, a bright-eyed, handsome young chap, whose ruddy cheeks looked rather as though the golf links might have tinted them, as opposed to the scorching blast of a furnace. William Messer was the train conductor over the run from Jersey City to Harrisburg, Horace G. Clark, the Pullman car conductor, through to Chicago, and W.S. Richards, the baggage master, as far as Pittsburgh. Engine number 1416 backed in from the yard at 4 o'clock, and with hardly a perceptible jolt, coupled onto her charge, consisting of the combination baggage, library, and smoking car Cassius, which also carries the barber shop, the sleeping car Marigold, the dining car, and, last of the quartet, the stateroom observation car Veritas. There was barely time for the conductor to introduce the novice, and for Traphagen and Denniston to install him at the fireman's window of the cab, when the last piece of baggage was pitched aboard, the iron gateway down at the riverward end of the train shed clanged shut, a blue-clad arm waved impatiently with a cry, "All right!" and then a toy whistle blew somewhere up in the labyrinth of tubes and levers from the cab. "Now, sit tight and look sharp. We're off," said Traphagen. Deftly as an artist fingering his brush, he reached for the big steel throttle and opened it gently. Responding to his touch, the ponderous machine glided forward with a series of guttural coughs, as if impatient to be off, and as she ran out into the sunlight, the chronometer hanging by the steam gauge marked exactly 4:14. Denniston was busy hurling great chunks of fuel into the blazing maw of the firebox, which to the novice seemed witheringly hot enough already to shrivel the skin on his face. Leaning far out from the cab on the fireman's side, as much to escape the awful heat as to note our progress, the reporter watched 1416 as she threaded her way like a sentient creature through the bewildering maze of switches that crisscrossed the terminal yard. Traphagen had been gradually opening the throttle. With her light train, it does not take 1416 long to get under way. She has begun her race with time, and every instant is precious. Already she is rattling along at a good round pace, dodging here to one side of a locomotive and there to a long line of standing cars. The fireman is tugging the bell rope now, but the ding-dong of the swinging bell comes back to the cab with a muffled and far-away sound. It is almost drowned out by the more insistent din of seething steam and the titanic pounding of giant driving wheels on frogs and rails. Of course, those switches are all set right. It is the highest duty of every man on the line to look out for 29, the pet of the road, but the novice riding for the first time this 110-ton steed feels first a sense of strange elation, and then comes the momentary thought unbidden. She is a knowing mastodon, his old 1416, but suppose she should fall a-napping and miss her cue at one of those switches some day. We are out of the tangle of rails now. Straight as a ruler across the salt meadows stretches the four-track avenue of steel. Traphagen makes a trumpet of his hands and bawls across the cab, "We let her out a little here!" Back comes the injection lever, and for a moment the churning of water into the pipe coils of the boiler mingles its sound with the infernal din of clanging metal and sizzling steam. Back comes the throttle another inch or two, and 1416, feeling the loosened rein, begins to show her paces. Trepidation is lost in a sense of pure exhilaration. What though the right side of the body and the right leg, from thigh to instep, be parboiled against the awful heat of the firebox? A tornado with a touch of salt ozone is rushing past the face and in at the cab window. A dozen times you clap your hand to your cap to see if it is still there. It is pulled down hard over the head, but you cannot feel it. You only feel the hair beneath it, ruffling in the cooling blast. The trickling rivulets of perspiration that have been coursing down the face through the mask of coal dust and grime are dried up or dashed away in the blast. You have caught the spirit of the race now. You long to see Traphagen give her her head. You lean far out and glue both eyes on the vista of steel ribbons stretching away to Newark. From the waist up, the body is in a cyclone. From the waist down, it is in a Russian bath. Perspiration is soaking through the pinstripe overalls and trickling down into the shoe tops, but the brain is tingling with the zest of the chase, and the face with the breadth of a hurricane. "She's doing quite a bit now," bellowed Denniston, as he paused from tossing fuel into the dragon's mouth and swung himself up on the box to shout in the ear of the novice. It was fast work, to be sure, but by this time the ills of the flesh were forgotten, and the spirit cried out, "Faster! Faster!" Newark, at first a mere blur of smoke-obscured mirage, loomed big ahead. In a twinkling it lay at our feet, and then we were dashing over the stone causeway spanning its streets. Traphagen let down the speed a notch and glanced at the chronometer. 9 miles in 9 minutes, he said. The Pennsylvania Special had crossed the meadows at a mile-a-minute gait, but she was to do better, much better, than that further on. Elizabeth, Rahway, Metuchen flashed by with hardly time enough for the eye to read the names on the station signboards, and then 1416 sprang across the Raritan and through New Brunswick at speed almost undiminished. Ever and anon a gang of track workers could be seen half a mile ahead on some straight stretch of roadbed, tinkering at the stone ballast. Reaching for his whistle cord, Traphagen let out a succession of long warning shrieks, and barely time there was for the toilers to look up, seize their tools, and scurry to cover when 1416 dashed past them and left them mere dots behind. At Monmouth Junction, for the first time, 1416 scooped water. This 110-ton monster of the Atlantic type, which had been devouring fuel at an astounding rate all the way from Jersey City, was thirsty now. She had to have a drink to replenish her depleted tanks, but the Pennsylvania Special's fast schedule from New York to Pittsburgh contemplates no such obsolete crudity as a stop to take water, so 1416 simply scoops it as she runs. All the way out from Jersey City, as each of the distant and home signals of the block system sprang successively into view, the voice of Traphagen or of Denniston, or often as not both simultaneously, could be heard bawling out some strange and to the untaught ear incoherent ejaculation. To the novice, there seemed at first something ominous and menacing in the sudden shout of an expletive that sounded to him like "Hi!" with a sharp falling inflection. He wondered for a time if one or both of those watchful men had not sighted peril ahead, or at least a cow on the track. But presently he learned what they cried was "White!" The rules of the road, for extra precaution, require that both engine driver and fireman shall call the signals to one another. So long as a cry is "White!" and not "Red," it means that all is well. It is the tower signalman's voucher of a clear track ahead. So the cry of "White," or, as Dennison after modified it, "White Eye," had grown monotonous to the novice. It now fell upon his ears dully. But suddenly here, near Princeton Junction, comes a cry from both about the same instant. "Red." It was not the cry of excitement, but was uttered in such a cool, deliberate tone that for a moment the writer, who had seen nothing amiss, thought his ears had deceived him. But a glance at Traphagen showed him already quietly at work with his levers. First, he had gently touched the air brake controller, a brass-handled switch not unlike the motorman's controller on a trolley car. The strident hiss of compressed air was heard above the roar, and then the master toyed with the speed lever. Instantly, the unbridled speed was checked. Another touch of the air controller brought it a little further around its arc, and again the speed slackened, but so gradually that no shock was felt. Except in cases of extreme emergency, no skilled engine driver puts his brakes on hard and fast at a single impulse. To do so would make havoc in every car behind him, turning chairs, tables, and probably passengers topsy-turvy. It is a point of pride with your expert to slow down and stop his mile-a-minute flyer so gently as not to spill the water or the coffee from glasses and cups in the dining car. So Traphagen deftly coaxed his charge to a standstill until the brakes set hard and fast. A distant signal had been set against him by an alert tower man who thought he saw a curl of smoke from a hot box as the train swept past his station. Out tumbled the curious passengers to see what the matter was, and down jumped Traphagen with a ready bucket of water. The trouble was trifling, but it sufficed to put number 29 nearly 4 minutes behind her schedule at Princeton Junction, and that was serious enough. It is hard to make up lost time on a schedule so swift as this, but the novice rejoiced secretly when Denniston nudged him as we got into motion again and whispered, "Now Trap will let her out. We'll go into Philadelphia on time yet. We lost 8 minutes not far from here the other day, but he took her into Harrisburg on the dot. That was a day we ran 189 miles in 202 minutes, and made parts of the run at a gait of 75 miles an hour." Trap had quit fuming now, and from the way he pulled things open, he evidently knew what was expected of him. He made no promises, but glanced at his watch and settled down to business. He drove his engine across Trenton with a long-drawn whoop of the whistle, and dashed over the Delaware and into Pennsylvania at Morrisville at so lively a pace that, if you had not known it of old, you could hardly have read the signboard at midstream on the bridge, which marks the state line between New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Bristol and Andalusia flew by. At Torresdale, the towering derricks of Philadelphia's new filtration plant were momentary features of a kaleidoscopic landscape. Tacony and the big mills of Fittler's, Bridesburg, and Frankfort vanished in turn, and then came the serried red brick and white marbled rows of North Philadelphia, which is as near to the real Philadelphia, centering on about the Broad Street station, as number 29 has time to go. In the colonial structure which marks the North Philadelphia stop, formerly known as Germantown Junction, the air brakes again shrieked a final hiss, and the flyer came to her first scheduled halt. Traphagen's eyes had been watching the clock, and also the landmarks. He leaned back upon his leather-cushioned rest with a smile, and held up the face of his watch. It was just 39 minutes past 5 o'clock. The Pennsylvania Special was a minute ahead of schedule. 45 miles in 35 minutes, said the engine driver. That's not bad. The train had run from Jersey City to Philadelphia in 85 minutes. Barely 2 minutes sufficed to stretch cramped legs with a jump from the locomotive cab to the station platform, and then number 29 must be off again in her inexorable race with time. Those 2 minutes Traphagen employed pouring oil from a long-necked can into crankshaft bearings and other mysterious places, and sundry mechanics with long hammers employed them in testing the car wheels of the whole train for possible weak spots, as they did at every stop. Forging ahead again, the panorama changed to one of beautiful suburban estates. Smooth areas of velvety greensward marked the wealthy homes of Bryn Mawr, Wayne, and Paoli. We were now speeding over the Philadelphia division of the main line, and at many points the well-kept gardens of Philadelphia's elect stretched in unbroken verdure right down to the line of the steel highway. In one of them, a lithe-limbed greyhound essayed a race with the Pennsylvania Special. Fleet as the creature was, we passed him as though he were a china dog cast in the pose of chase, and his defiant yelp was lost in the rushing whirlwind behind us. Approaching Harrisburg, the men from the steel mills ranged along the tracks shouted a greeting, which Traphagen good-naturedly acknowledged with a toot-toot from his whistle. Lights were twinkling from windows of the houses as we ran into the Pennsylvania state capitol, but there was enough of twilight left to display the lofty dome of the new Capitol building dominating the picture. Directly in the path of the train, the myriad switch lights of the railroad yard flashed like an army of fireflies, threading her way through them all, 1416 pulled up at Harrisburg Station, a trifle ahead of time, at 35 minutes past 7 o'clock. Her work was done there, and so was Traphagen's. Both now were due for a well-earned rest. It was interesting to note how this iron-nerved man relaxed now that his task was done. He dropped the throttle almost with a sigh of relief, and when his guest turned to thank him, he had words of praise only for his engine. "Isn't she a beauty?" he said. "Glad you enjoyed the run. There isn't a better engine in the country." Every engine driver with whom the writer traveled said the same thing of his own pet. In less than 5 minutes, 1416 had pulled out for her night berth in the roundhouse, and 2015 had backed down and coupled on for the night run over the Middle, or Mountain, Division. R.H. Greenwood was the engine driver of this locomotive, with C. Farmington as his fireman. M.H. Melvin succeeded to the post of train conductor. From this point, a fourth occupant of the cab was Charles Douglas, traveling engineer of the division, who was making the trip from Harrisburg to Altoona almost daily on the fast trains to note points where curve elevations may be improved on this most arduous division of the whole run to Chicago. At Harrisburg, the novice, feeling hungry, found that the package of ham sandwiches, which had lain at his feet close to the firebox, had suffered. The ham was almost broiled, and the bread was toasted, while a bag of peaches were in a state of sizzling stew. A waiter from the dining car was welcomed when he thrust into the cab a plate of broiled chicken and vegetables, neatly tied up in a napkin, with the compliments of the steward. And now began the most weird chapter of the journey, a night climb up the Allegheny Mountains, through squalls of rain that stung the face like sleet, a dash into the darkness with only the lights to guide aright, with the frowning silhouette of the mountainside looming up on one side and the abyss often yawning into the other. Up the steep grade leaped 2015 as Greenwood pushed her to task. There must be no shirking because of grades or darkness or abysmal depths below. The schedule is fast, even in the mountain reaches. In the cab all is dark, save for the fitful glow of a small lantern illuminating the water gauge and the dials of the chronometer, steam gauge, and the steam regulator of the dynamo, which from its place, back in the combination car, is flooding the passengers with radiant light in the snug cars behind. Again and again, Farmington swings open, on its long iron chain, the door of the firebox to toss in more fuel. Then, momentarily, the cab is ruddy with the fiery gleam from the furnace. Mountainside and gorge are revealed in the red light like some hellish inferno, through which we are plunging, and the fireman is a sweltering demon. Then the door swings shut again, blotting out the picture, to leave all more darkly mysterious than before. Douglas continues to call the signals. A fireman on this division, he roars into his neighbor's ear, has no time to ride the box. He has to keep stoking her all the time. Rain is now slanting down in long, lance-like shafts. Douglas rigs back the plate-glass storm window and fastens it securely with an iron hook to shield our faces from the lashing drops as we peer out ahead, cheek by jowl, through the blackness. It is only a 6-inch wide strip of iron-bound glass, set at right angles to the side of the cab and outside of it, but it partly breaks the violence of the whipping gale of wind and water. In his hand Douglas holds a wad of cotton waste, with which alternately he mops his face and then wipes clean the rain-dashed outer surface of the storm window. To his guest, Douglas has given a similar ball of cotton waste. It is the courtesy of the cab to do so. The absorbent serves conveniently alike as a hand towel, a wash rag, and a perspiration mop. When the fireman turns on his hose to flush out the grime and coal dust from behind the firebox, it is pleasant to hold that bunch of cotton waste under the stream and then color it gradually, meerschaum-like, with the soot from your fevered face and hands. Just ahead looms out of the night a triangular display of green and red lanterns. They are hung from the rear of a long train of freight and ore cars bound westward, like ourselves. It looks as though we must surely douse those lights and telescope that train, but that is only a delusion. The track swerves slightly just ahead, and we go careening past the lights and the loaded tons of ore close enough to reach out to them, and probably to lose an arm. The novice thought that freight train was standing still, until the sight of the driving wheels of its locomotive in rapid motion surprised him. "That train is moving at 20 miles an hour, yelled Douglas, but we're doing better than 60 now. Look ahead. See the fire belching from our stack. She's doing about all that she can now, on such a grade." On this tortuous middle division, with the exception of 1 or 2 good stretches, there is hardly a continuous 2 miles of straight roadbed. The Juniata, winding its sinuous mountain course, is crossed 14 times on stone bridges within a space of a few miles. At 2 such points, the new masonry bridges are not yet completed. Over the old structures, the mighty Pennsylvania Special has to slow down nightly to the modest pace of 20 miles an hour. As the schedule at present does not allow enough margin for these controls, the lost time must be made up elsewhere before Altoona is reached. 4 minutes were thus lost from the schedule, but on a good piece of road near Huntingdon, Greenwood almost balanced accounts by reeling off a run at the rate of 77 miles an hour, and later he made his engine rock over the rails like a ship laboring in a gale, while Douglas, who held the watch on the racer, announced several miles at the rate of a mile in 45 seconds, or 80 miles an hour. Altoona was reached on time at 10 minutes past 10 o'clock. There we dropped the dining car. The steepest climb of all lay just ahead until we reached the mountain tops at Cresson. Greenwood retired rain-soaked with 2015, and W.R. Jones, familiarly known as Bill, one of the most genial engine drivers on the road, and one of the best, backed down his own particular pet, number 1605, for the run over the Pittsburgh division, with J.C. Potts as fireman. J.E. Thorne here took charge as train conductor, and an extra locomotive was ranged up in front of 1605 to help pull up to the summit, where she dropped off on a Y-switch without interference or stoppage. Now the special rounded the famous Horseshoe curve, but in the black, rain-scourged night the great bend and chasm below it were lost in one impenetrable pall of gloom. Peering out the cab window, we could see our train bending like a bow as she swung around, displaying her rear lights, and it was easy enough to feel the 100-ton machine on which we rode list over as she took the curve. The novice, in his zeal to fathom the depths, unwisely pocketed his automobile goggles, and regretted it the next minute, when some bituminous samples out of the stack of the pilot engine smote his eyes and cheeks like hot bird shot, and started unbidden tears coursing down his soot-stained cheeks. Beyond the summit came a wild run with loosened rein down the mountain slopes. Old 1605 took the bit in her teeth as she galloped down through the fateful Conemaugh Valley and into Johnstown of tragic memory. The steel mills were aglow with vivid life, and further on, near Greensburg, long rows of flaring coke ovens made the trackside luminous with serried fires, like the bivouac of an army. Jeanette, Braddock, and the scenes of historic industrial struggles were flaunting their beacons to the sky. Next, the straggling expanse of the East Liberty stockyards, and then another fairyland of glistening switchlights spanned by steel bridges, showing block signals and flanked by brilliantly lighted signal towers, and then the hissing of the air brakes as number 29 pulled into the Union Station at Pittsburgh. She was on time as usual. It was half an hour after midnight by Eastern Time, and an hour earlier by Central Time. After a 5-minute stop and another change of engine and crew, the special was off for her run across the more level stretches of Ohio and Indiana. Twice again she changed horses in the long relay race across 4 great states, once at Crestline, Ohio, and again for the final sprint at Fort Wayne, Indiana. Tired nature revolted. Rocked in the swaying cab to a titanic lullaby of infernal sounds, the novice drowsed off into a fitful sleep, from which ever and anon he roused with a start, only to hear the hackneyed but reassuring cry, "White light," and to relapse into a contented state of semi-consciousness. As 29 rolled into Englewood early the next morning, the suburban Chicago girls were on their way to early church, and the peal of church chimes mingled not unmusically with the clanging bell of the locomotive. On the tick of scheduled time, at 5 minutes past 9 o'clock, the Pennsylvania Special discharged her passengers into the Chicago station. A tired, muscle-sore, black-faced novice, as dark of appearance now as any of the Pullman car porters, shed his soot-stained overalls in the baggage car. He then sought a life-saving station, where a good Samaritan extracted bituminous coal specimens from under one eyelid, and afterward administered a delectable Turkish bath, a shampoo, and a facial massage. The Pennsylvania Special eastbound is known as number 28. When she left Chicago that afternoon, at 2:45 o'clock, she carried as one of her pampered passengers a man normally clothed and in his sound mind, resolved, despite inflamed eyes, upon enjoying all the ease of luxurious travel. Yet he had to confess, as he crossed the Hudson for the second time within 42 hours, that the run with number 29 was more interesting than the trip on number 28.